My guest today is Chris Edwards. He has a EDD and teaches AP World History, that is Advanced Placement World History, and an English course on critical thinking at a public high school in the Midwest. And he's the author of To Explain It All, Everything You Wanted to Know About the Popularity of World History Today, Connecting the Dots in World History, Democracy, How Educators Can Teach Democratic Ideals in Feminism, and Beyond Obsolete, How to Upgrade Classroom Practice and School Structure. His new book is Thought Experiments, History and Applications for Education. Okay, most of our conversation today, almost 2 hours, went all on education, the problems with our educational system, K through 12, higher education, the problem that public schools are divided up by zip code, and that creates this Matthew effect of to those who have more shall be given, and that real estate goes up in school districts with better schools, and that therefore poor school districts have crummier schools, and you get this massive division. We talk about that as possibly an example of one of these, sort of systemic racism problems that has nothing to do with personal racism. Everybody could be as liberal and tolerant as could be, and you still have these kind of built-in divisions that are, the result of this, century-long structure of our educational system, public educational system. Anyway, so from there we talk about how to change that. That we have a seat time model. How many hours, 180 hours, have to be spent in students with their butts in the seats, and that's the criteria. Well, how about we have a mastery learning model? That is to say, do you actually master the skill you're trying to learn? Anyway, we spent a long time on that because there's so many now online options for that. One of which, by the way, and I'll note this since they're one of the sponsors of this podcast, and we do talk about that simply because they're one of the pioneers of that. And that's the great courses now called Wondrium. As you know, I have 2 great courses myself on Skepticism 101 and on conspiracies. And I wanted to tell you about their new program, which is called Wondrium. Wondrium is, it's a whole program online. And it's available on an app. I always use my phone as an example here. You just touch the magic W and up pops all the different programs, documentary series, and of course courses and lectures. Like here's one that just popped up today, Mind-Blowing Science. So I touch Watch Now, and up pops all these lectures. Okay, so let's see how many lectures there are. 15 episodes of the series, including How Dinosaurs Grew So Large and So Small. Why are we the only intelligent life in the galaxy? Ooh, super cool topic. I love that one. Decoding the puzzle of human consciousness. Oh, just 30 minutes to answer that question. Oh, 20 minutes. Okay, good. The hard problem of consciousness. The first monster black holes. Pets, why do we have them? The mysteries of Neanderthal art. 6 ways to boost brain power. In other words, a lot of cool stuff. Okay, so here's how the program works. If you access this through my podcast, you get a free month trial. That is a month free long access to all their content. Just tons of free stuff. Programs, documentary series, various episodes of different shows, and of course, all these great courses with dozens of lectures on each of them. So you just go to wondrium.com/Shermer. That's WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, SHERMER, as I'm sure you know. Wondrium.com/Shermer gets you a free full month. Access it. And let me just add, we don't have a lot of advertisers on this program. I'm trying to get straight to the point of the subject of the guest's book or research and so on. And so the program is primarily supported by you, the listeners, both through donating to the Skeptic Society, but more importantly, going to these kinds of sites. I wouldn't recommend this if I didn't use it myself. I do. I listen to these courses all the time, these programs and episodes, and now documentary series. It's the only way, really, it's the best way to keep up as an autodidact. Keep learning. Never stop. It never stops. I'm 66. I feel like I've just begun my education. All right. I like to learn, and and learning should never stop. It should always go on. Anyway, that's one of the big issues we talk about, because as we learned in the pandemic, you don't have to go to a brick and mortar building to learn stuff. You can do it online. And so we then extrapolate that into the future. What is the future of education? And from there, Chris and I talk about his latest book on thought experiments. To what extent do educators use thought experiments? All the time. Turns out it's not just Einstein and his thought experiment about riding on a beam of light. In fact, almost all of philosophy is grounded in these thought experiments. Some are better than others. And then we end by kind of extrapolating how you apply thought experiments to our daily lives and how that works out. So enjoy this conversation with Chris Edwards. Chris Edwards, thanks for joining the show. Nice to see you and finally meet you in person. Well, not in person exactly, but digitally, virtually in person.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Well, you're our listeners may remember your name from a number of articles you've written for Skeptic on quite a wide range of topics. So let's just start there. Kind of just tell us, who are you? What's your thing? I mean, your official biography. I've already have read that you teach AP World History at a public high school in the Midwest, and you're an author of a bunch of different books I will have introduced, and we'll be talking about the new one on thought experiments, which is super interesting. But just give us kind of a broad overview.
Well, yeah, I'm about to enter my 20th year as a public school teacher, and I have really been interested in the development of cross-curricular connections and using methods of going across academic disciplines to hopefully see connections between those disciplines, and then sometimes use those connections for perspective to solve novel problems. Very interested in Consilience by Edward O. Wilson. We kind of called for a new kind of approach to approaching academic problems or philosophical problems. And I've always felt that world history is not a subject; it's all the subjects. Because when you start asking world historical questions, by necessity, you end up finding yourself moving beyond traditional historical methods. That leads to connections that sometimes filter well beyond what is a traditional historical or discipline for history, and it has an effect on mathematics and philosophy. So I've used that approach, and I found your magazine, Skeptic, has been one of the places where it is possible to use that approach to develop some new ideas and find publication for that.
Yeah, I think of those kinds of books as what are called third culture books. This is after C.P. Snow's famous essay on two cultures that kind of divide between the sciences and the arts and humanities, and that he wanted to bring them together, what now would be called consilience. And so I think of books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, which would be one of your classic cases of world history. Just trying to bring together all different fields: anthropology, sociology, economics, politics, history, and so on, to answer one question: why did civilizations develop at different rates around the world over the past 13,000 years? I mean, hello, that's like a 600-page answer. And but that's what it takes. And so is that how you teach AP history?
I developed a method many years ago. One of the problems I've seen with education has been that we have all of this knowledge now about how students learn, and we have all of this knowledge from neuroscience. And virtually none of the materials that teachers are given to teach students are in any way shaped with what we now know about how students learn. Interestingly enough, about the same time that Jared Diamond published Guns, Germs, and Steel, there was a very influential book that came out that was called Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Lowen. And Lowen made the case that, yeah, that textbooks are kind of like, I think he compared them to fishing lures. Fishing lures are designed to catch fishermen. They're not about catching fish, that you're trying to get the person to purchase the fishing lure, and that textbooks were not really designed to teach anybody. They were sort of designed to get through textbook adoption committees. And that made them very bland, made them very unexciting, because they weren't really trying to teach students. They were just trying to be as non-controversial as possible to get through those adoption boards. And so partially to get around those kinds of materials, I developed a connect the dots methodology for teaching, which would dive into something like Jared Diamond. I draw upon his work, and then you just start putting dots in front of kids. And the analogy there is that in the same way you play a connect the dots game, you're given this seemingly random set of dots, you connect them and see the bigger picture. That a way to educate students is to give them shorter pieces of reading and then see how those connect across the board to this bigger picture emerges. And then you just continue adding to those pictures until they begin to grow this comprehensive kind of cognitive connect the dots map within their own head. And there's been some other work that I think recently has been done that have recognized that the kinds of materials that teachers have been given to use really aren't effective, and that we've got to have some kind of a new approach that actually takes what we know about how people learn into account. And I've been active with. Oh, I just said I put that connect the dots methodology through the National Council for Social Studies. Put it through the appropriate peer review and did some publications and presentations with them. And then I've also used that method myself to try to address problems, sometimes even outside of the history. Outside of history, to showcase that this kind of cross-curricular thinking can be useful in other arenas. But you're exactly right that all of that was inspired by the kinds of things that Jared Diamond was doing. Some other big thinkers, Jared Diamond and Edward O. Wilson in the 90s, published some things that have been really influential on everything that I've done.
Yeah, I also think in the type specimen of the genre, Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, this is not the popular version of his technical papers. It's the only version there is, in which he's kind of bringing together different threads from evolutionary theory, Bob Trivers and Richard Alexander and John Maynard Smith and others, in a way that no one else had done before. And it's not only an important work of science; it's an important work of literature. I mean, it's a highly readable, not just highly readable as in popular, but really beautifully written. And I think of some of Stephen Jay Gould's early works like that, Steven Pinker's books, and so on. I try to model my own writing on that. It's hard to do, but again, like Darwin's Origin of Species, that's not the pop version of his technical papers. It's the only version there is. And, I think there's value in that. I think because of this false dichotomy we have between scholarly books and popular so-called dumbed down books. This is a bad way to look at it. It's kind of treating readers with disrespect. Like, you're so stupid, you're not going to understand, the technical version of my theory, so I'm going to dumb it down. No. How about the burden is on you, the writer, to make it clear and interesting? Because there's so many books to choose from, right? So I'm sort of ranting on a personal thing I've had for decades that, I think it's a challenge to try to do that, and that's hard. But again, you teach AP history. So those not familiar with this, so this is advanced placement. This is for, I guess, smarter students or students with better grades or whatever. And I remember when that was introduced, I think when I was in high school back in the 70s, early 70s maybe. But in any case, is that still the way it was designed for, like advanced students, and how is it treated now?
Yeah, it's very controversial. The College Board has enormous influence across public education. Their economic model is really based around the idea that they will have this class that they offer that they refer to as advanced placement, and students will take this comprehensive 4-hour test at the end of the year. I think it's they have environmental science, there's physics, world history, U.S. history, a few others. And in most states, if you get a score of 1 to 5 on that. In most states, if you get a 3 or above, you get college credit. But they have some very influential people. State of Indiana, the Speaker of the House is the Vice President for College Board within the state, and so they've got a considerable amount of authority over these tests being presented in schools, and it's a one-time test given once a year, and it's been controversial because in a lot of states the publicly funded schools have to accept a 3 or above as college credit. And a lot of those universities are not necessarily wanting to do that. And so there's been some discussion about what what exactly a score on an advanced placement exam should be worth going into the next level of the colleges. So, but yeah, I've taught that for a while, and it's essentially I
Wait,
think when students sign
why
up
is
for
it
it.
that they don't? Why is it the universities don't want to accept those credits?
Well, you take an AP exam for about $85 on the high end, and
I
universities would
see.
charge.
I see. I
Well,
see.
and
Okay.
yeah, oh yeah, it boils down to that. Well,
Oh, come
and
on.
the
Wow.
college board can make one test and then variations of the test and then disperse it and charge $85 a piece for it. Whereas if you taught the same class in a university, you have to pay the professor, you have to keep the lights on, you have to have all of the things that go around a class that would cost money. And so it's been you have some students going into college with close to a year's worth of credits sometimes or semester
Hmm.
from these as a result. And
Have you seen any pushback in the realm of like the SAT tests are being canceled by a lot of universities because they claim it unfairly discriminates against people of color and so forth. Is the AP like that also undergoing that?
well, not as much. I'm researching a book now that's it's based off of the last paper that I've done, or Skeptic, which was on post-pandemic higher education. Um, there's a whole, I think, a series. I'm taking a little bit of a different approach to those kinds of questions because I think one thing that has not really factored into many of the discussions I've heard about SAT and College Board and institutional racism, et cetera, has been the effect that local school districts have had on property values. And so if you go back about 20 years, one of the big effects of No Child Left Behind was that it tried to pit a kind of analogy, put an analogy on school districts that school districts sort of like companies, and you could recognize the how effective a school was in the same way you would that a business. In businesses, you look at the Dow or Nasdaq stock reports, and in schools, you look at the test scores. And as far as I can tell, the only people who benefited from No Child Left Behind were suburban real estate agents because they very quickly found that you could define a school as good if it had 30% higher or 30% the scores that were 30% above normal, and that people would pay big money, 30 or 40% more for the same house. If you had house A and house B in the same square footage, same yard, and house A is in a good school district and house B isn't, people were paying sometimes $200,000, $250,000 more for House A in the good school district. And that became a real driving force for a lot of local communities. Not uncommon at all to see real estate agents on local school boards. In fact, some of the big real estate agency websites have specific directions on how to run for school board, why you should. And
That's
then
crazy.
chambers of commerce kind of got involved in that because if you were in a suburban or urban community, you're bringing in people that were paying that kind of money for houses, they're spending money. And I think that eventually what happened with that was that schools found themselves under tremendous pressure from the business community to basically engage in public relations to say, uh, we've got no problems here. Everybody's above average. That there's no racism, there's no sexism. Everybody's happy. Look at the banners we've got in the gyms and in the auditoriums. And that kind of had the effect of turning schools into places where um, the idea that somebody wasn't doing well or that there were problems was not something that could be put out publicly. And so I think some of the issues that we're seeing with students and school speech codes and on the campuses, et cetera, have been driven by the fact that there's enormous pressure with schools to put on a positive public face all the time, as opposed to actually having discussions over things that might be problematic.
So I'm wondering, Chris, if this might be an example of this systemic racism that critical race theory talks about, where maybe nobody in the community is racist. Maybe they're as liberal and open and tolerant as can be the early 21st century. But there is a wealth gap between races and an income gap. And so people of color, just fewer are going to be able to afford the more expensive neighborhood because of the schools there that are better. And then you get one of these feedback loops where just the better schools get better. The Matthew effect. To those who have, more shall be given. It's the way it works. And then the poorer schools, no one wants to go to those. So maybe the teachers are not as high quality. I don't know, just equipment, the salaries. I don't know enough about it to know what else would be bad about that. But it seems like that could be an inherent system-wide problem that I have no idea how you fix that. You just got to see how it happens without anybody being intentionally racist or bigoted.
I think it's the entire problem. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. The effect was that if you going again back to about 2000, and I'll reference the latest paper that you published on post-pandemic higher education, which is that the prices of college have continued to go up in the last 20 years, despite the fact that you can get learning, if you just want to learn something, you can get that next to nothing now or nothing. And I like to say to people, when we talk about education, there's only really one question that matters, which is, what would you do if you needed to learn something? And it's really fairly simple. If you needed to learn where all the countries on the map were, would you take a class? Would you drive to a college campus, or would you download World Map Quiz onto your phone and just play it until you could recognize where those are at? And so the universities have, I just kind of mentioned what's happened, kind of a clustering effect within suburban and urban schools. That's the pipeline to the universities. And so the universities have a model based on the exclusivity of their institutions. And they want to get as many people to apply for their schools as possible, largely so they can turn them away. And they found that the places where they're going to get those tuition is by the tuition payments is by tapping into those networks that we just discussed, where there are high numbers of students going into quote unquote good schools as defined by test scores. And what's happened then is how do you attract those students to your campus? And very rarely is that the quality of the professors. It's on the campus tours. They don't stop and talk to professors about ideas. They look at the size of the football stadium, how cushy the dorm is, the exercise facility.
The climbing wall,
and
the swimming pool.
That's right.
It's like a club med.
You're exactly right, and almost as expensive in some cases. And it's created a system there that was, I think, based around what you were talking about, a certain set of norms that some people just feel alienated from or can't afford. And so what is the response all too often of the people inside a system like that? It's not to actually get in and fix the system. It's to create a department that handles the problem. And so I find that I think there's hope that if there's a potential to move away from what Sanjay Sarma wrote a really great book called Grasp, who's at MIT. He's the head of the Open Educational Resources Program. He says that we need to move away from a seat time model where students have to be in a seat for 180 days a year and move towards a mastery learning model, which MIT has actually put a credential on now. And that may be, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but that might be the thing that saves education.
Yeah, it's interesting. I just got a letter from the dean at Chapman University, one of the deans, I forget who, to all of us, that you are not to dismiss the students for the final exam week. Because a lot of us just give, written assignments, or they have to do a research paper, turn it in or something like that. I'm not going to sit them down in their seats and give them questions to answer off the top of their heads. It's just not how it's a seminar that I run. But I have to sit there for 3 hours nevertheless, because it was something like what you just said. We have to fulfill the number of hours per semester to be credentialed, whatever it was, something like that. I thought, okay, well, I guess we'll just have a pizza party or something, and I'll show Skeptic videos or something like that. It's kind of crazy. Now back to the more systemic problem is that these are public schools, and the schools are divided by zip code. So the zip code you happen to live in that's the school you go to, and that's how public schools work. I presume in all states. And so people are then, as you described, migrating to the zip codes where the better schools are, and then therefore the housing prices go up and so on. Well, what if we didn't do it that way? Maybe a systemic change would be you can send your kid anywhere you want, everybody, like school vouchers, something like that, something the equivalent of school vouchers or whatever. And then, of course, I think the pushback against that from teachers' unions is that, well, then everybody would want to go to the best schools. It's like, yeah, no kidding, of course. What's wrong with that? Well, because some of the schools are crappy, and we don't want to can't fire the bad teachers or whatever because the unions protect them, and then you get into the kind of politics of that. Could that ever change?
Yeah, but not by traditional models. I've been working on this. This is actually the subject of my new book I'm writing now. I've given up on the idea of any kind of comprehensive school reform model. There's something like 13,600 school districts in the United States,
Oh,
and they're all
whoa.
developed along a kind of medieval line. They're quite literally feudal, which is that the school board elects a superintendent. The superintendent has his or her own court with administrators, and then they develop policy that's supposed to be in alignment with state and federal law, and then they sort of disseminate that to the principals who have their own group, and that's supposed to filter down into the classrooms. It's really hard to reform a model like that, and if you go back to 20 years or so ago, most of the reform models with charter schools and vouchers kind of wanted to empower the administrative class. There were several studies done in the late 90s and early 2000s that indicated the only real factor that mattered for improving student achievement at school was the quality of the classroom teacher. And so the very studies that said that teachers were the most important factors were the ones that disempowered teachers, because that kind of notion of fire the worst or hire the best is not scalable. There's not an infinite pool of teachers. In fact, there's a shortage out here that are highly effective to take the place of the so-called worst. And so, by analogy, if you have a hospital president who wants to improve her outcomes for her hospital, and she does that by hiring all of the best surgeons from rural or urban districts, she's improved outcomes for her one hospital, but to the detriment of those other hospitals by taking their best surgeons. And so, there's no overall effect there that improves outcomes. And so much of my research has been on more effective forms of professional development. But what MIT is doing now is really developing this open educational model, what they call MOOC, massive open online courses, which is very similar to what you have with Wondrium or what used to be the Great Courses, which is where you could actually centralize education, have these modules, and then replicate those modules across all of the school districts. And students could work through those modules and demonstrate mastery of their learning. And then the teachers could have they wouldn't have to grade papers anymore, but they could have opportunities to be connected specifically to the community or to the local colleges and business communities, STEM communities, and then develop lessons that sort of fill in gaps with the mastery learning model. So you have a mastery learning model with a gap that the teacher would then use for the local community. And then when students created a product, you could have the effect of someone coming in from the business community and saying, look, I'm hiring people to do what you just did for your class. And so that's one of the big complaints of rural communities in particular, is that kids get a college education, they leave, instead of coming back here and helping us solve local problems. And so you could develop those connections with a mastery learning model and ensure that students get a really good education across school districts, regardless of their zip code, with those kinds of models. And there's some great examples. There's Flipping Physics. There's physicsclassroom.com. You go to YouTube. There's a PBS Crash Course Physics. I'm just using physics as an example here. You can watch them as many times as you want, wherever you want. The great courses are Wondrium. You can listen to them. You can watch them while you're exercising, doing the dishes. The professor doesn't get upset with you for asking questions. And we could develop that kind of system that would be applicable to all students at all times, as opposed to a seat time model, where students figure out pretty quickly. And I think a lot of parents had this experience, which is that you can kind of muddle through and get a grade. And a lot of parents had this experience with the pandemic of looking in the grade book that they have access to and saying to the kid, hey, you've got a D in such and such class. And the kid rolls their eyes and they go in and they submit two or three things, and all of a sudden they've got a B minus. And what skill was mastered that moved that from a D to a B minus, other than something was turned in and the fulfillment of the seat time requirement was done? It really doesn't make a lot of sense to have a system like that.
Seat time, yeah, that's quite a phrase. Um, yeah, just to well, you mentioned Great Courses. Wondrium is the new name now. They're a longtime sponsor of this podcast, but only really because I've been a fan since they started, really, and even before that, I was listening to books on tape, literally cassette tapes in the '80s. I
Yeah.
would, my long distance bike rides, I would pack in 2 or 3 90-minute tapes in my left pocket and have one in the little what you call it, Sony Walkman, and I'd flip them over and all that stuff. It's just such a great way to get content while you're doing something else. And really, there's quite a few companies now doing that. I do wonder, like with the MOOCs, I remember I brought this up with one of my bosses at Chapman University, and it's like, we can make this entire course for free online. And they were like, are you out of your mind? People are paying $50,000 a year for education here. It's
Yeah.
like, well, yeah, that's right. Well, then what happened last March, the campus closed. So I just recorded all my lectures for my Skepticism 101 class. They're available now for free. We uploaded them on skeptic.com, and so people could access them. And of course, Steve Pinker did the same thing. You can take Steve Pinker's course on rationality and his course this semester on introductory psychology, psychological science, it's called, and for free. You don't have to pay Harvard $50,000. You can get it for free. Right now, at some point, you can't scale that up because people have to be paid, and you got a brick and mortar building, you got to keep the lights on, and so forth. So there has to be payment somewhere. But just talk for a minute about why college education has gone up so much more than any other basket of goods you want to talk about, a gallon of gas or a quart of milk or a loaf of bread or whatever, the last 30 years.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, the economic model and what I'm researching with the great courses is fascinating. When that was introduced back in the 90s, I think it was the 1990s, um, the DVDs and the CDs cost about what you would pay for a college credit just for one set. And now, for what, $15 or $20 a month or less, if you go through your website, you can have access to all of them. So that's the actual market rate of learning right now. The market rate of learning, the same forces that have brought entertainment down have brought learning down. As I mentioned before, I can download World Map Quiz for nothing, and it's one of the most effective it's the most effective educational tool if you're just trying to learn geography, because it's
How does
all
it work? I
assessment.
don't know
You're
that.
just taking
I
it
don't
all
know
the
that.
time. And that's well, we now know from a whole bunch of studies that we teach too much and assess too little. That the assessment should be a teaching tool. We usually use tests, and maybe this is the issue with the College Board and SAT, is those are all autopsies. This is the end product of your learning, and we like that in education for some reason. We take a final and we dissect it, and here's your autopsy report, and you got a 70% in the class. Which, if you just needed to learn something, you would never stop yourself in the middle of a process and give yourself a grade or a percentage. You would just recognize that was, if you were just learning it for your own purposes. And so when you look at something like World Map Quiz, if it says Guatemala, you click on Honduras, it'll tell you it's wrong and then show you where Guatemala's at. And then the next time you'll probably know where Guatemala's at. And so it's all assessment, and you just keep playing it. And there are three different levels: easy, medium, and hard. And if you play it hundreds of times, you've really not sat in a class. You've done nothing but assess yourself over and over and over again as a learning tool. But after playing it hundreds of times, you get to know where all of those countries are. It's enormously effective, and we could do that with open online courses. I mean, you can imagine a situation where a student needed to learn quadratics, and maybe one student gets it after 10 questions, another one after 100, but they both get to the same place. If they master how to use quadratics, what difference does it make? And that's actually another point about grading. It's something that really hurts the self-esteem of kids. It gets into, I think grading is the most cynical part of it. it's the worst symptom that we have in public education because um, it doesn't have any significance other than it signals to the structure that this student is going to be what Sanjay Sarma calls winnowed into an elite class. And so it doesn't have any function for your actual learning of anything. It's just purely for the structure to put you in a category. And then they determine whether or not you get into the institution. So that comes back to your question, which is why has it gotten so expensive? We continue to act as if it's the Middle Ages. At one time, it was possible to justify the enormous costs of college education because you could say, look, we've got scholars here, we've got experts, you've got to come listen to them. You've got to come sit in a seat and listen to them. And they're going to give you a reading list and hold you accountable, et cetera. So therefore, we need to know through IQ tests, through SATs. This was kind of the subject of Gould's great book, Mismeasure of Man, that we reify all of those concepts into, IQ becomes intelligence as opposed to potential indicator. And so we use all of those as indicators to determine your potentiality and then let you enter into the institution. But you can determine potentiality in two ways. If I want to know your potentiality for understanding how to calculate the force of friction, I can either give you this battery of IQ tests, or I can actually teach you how to do the force of friction. And then if you can demonstrate to me that you can do it, I can go back and say that you once had potential. And we can now do that across the board. We can actually just teach content and skills and see who learns it and see who doesn't. We don't have to judge for potentiality. But we're acting as if that doesn't exist. And I think what's happened here can be defined as a kind of economic mass delusion. It's a bubble. But normally when economists talk about bubbles, it's something new. It's Bitcoin or it's a 17th century tulip, and you have exuberance that goes like this. But what we have now is in the last 15 or 20 years, the internet, the reasons you just said, you can get Dr. Pinker's lectures, Robert Sapolsky's lectures from Stanford, all for free. And so what's happened is the bubbles formed because the bottom's dropped. And we're having trouble recognizing that we no longer have to go to institutions and live there and spend money to get that education. In fact, that's one of the least effective means of learning something right now. Because if I go to a college and take a class, I've got to sit there and have content delivered to me once through a verbal lecture. Whereas if I use some of these other sources, they're available to me at all times if I just want to learn it. So why are people going to the college? Well, they're going for the credentials. And if you start looking at YouTube, I find this so disturbing because I've been studying a lot of mathematics and physics. I go to YouTube all the time. Sometimes I have to watch the videos 5 or 6 times. Look at the comments. The comments underneath it say all the time, you just explained to me in 5 minutes what my professor couldn't do in a semester. Or I just learned for free in 10 minutes what I'm paying $30,000 a semester to learn. And in some cases during the pandemic, you were recording your own lectures. I did the same kind of thing for my students. There were some teachers and professors that just sort of took some of those links and posted them on their Canvas pages to watch. So students are quite literally now paying for the exact link that everybody else can get for free. And the pandemic had the effect of really rendering that seat time model, I think, as totally absurd. And
Yeah, so let's say I'm back in the classroom in the fall, and I announced to my 25 seminar students, basically all the lectures for this course I recorded last semester. You can watch them anytime you want. Here's the URL. And by the way, everyone gets an A in the class. I'm not going to offer any grades because this is so evaluative and it's unfair. Well, I'm pretty sure daily attendance is going to drop dramatically. It's like, fuck it. I'm just going to go down to the gym and work out and watch Shermer's lecture later and write that paper for him on my own time. And why do I need to go spend 3 hours listening to this guy droning on at the chalkboard?
yeah, that's exactly what would happen.
Right. So this is why we're not doing this, because this is the model
that's
that we
exactly
have.
right. That's exactly. Well, if we go back to the essential question of what would you do if you needed to learn something, or I always say, you can ask that in different ways. At some point, you run up to to the boundary of what a MOOC would be. You don't want to learn surgery that way. You don't want to learn probably higher level. But I think it's entirely possible. And this is actually something that I had written in the last paper for you, for Skeptic, was we're not entirely sure what the bachelor's degree actually imparts anymore. Some really disturbing studies indicating that people with bachelor's degree aren't really improving their cognitive skills.
Hmm.
So why not just do away with it?
But it does still matter, like lifelong earnings. People with a bachelor's degree make X times more than people without it, whatever that metric is worth.
Yeah, and that's where we come back to what I think are the systemic issues that are becoming so controversial, which is to say, if you have this pipeline sort of from the suburbs to the universities, that creates a kind of culture. There was a really good book a few years ago called "Excellent Sheep" by a Princeton professor. I think it was maybe a Yale professor, and he'd done a paper in the American Scholar. I think it was Desowitz. I can't pronounce his name very well, but he said that you could pull anybody off an Ivy League campus, and they're all ready for a job interview at any given moment. There's nobody out here that's acting strangely or going through. There's no goth kids or anybody like that that's kind of outside the norm on a college campus at the Ivy Leagues. And there's a cultural norm that develops when kids are sort of funneled through that system. What Brian Kaplan in his book, The Case Against Education, he calls that signaling. He says that he's done some work here based on what economists have done. I think the best analogy for signaling is if I meet somebody that's got nice straight white teeth, how many things, if I do a Sherlock Holmes, how many things can I tell about them from that? That they've had braces, that if they've had braces, they probably come from a good middle class home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, kind of down the line. That a college degree has the effect of signaling that someone has the kind of right academic background or life background, that they've learned a certain set of norms that are going to work really well in the workplace. Whether they actually got an education or not is sort of by the way with that. It's about mannerisms and dress and appropriate workplace interactions more so than it is about actual skills or content.
And it shows
And
you
that
can
seems to
finish
be
something that you start.
That's exactly right. Well, there's more
Maybe.
bad news about all of that,
Uh-oh.
which is that as I was researching the number of cheating scandals,
Oh.
that if you start looking back they did some studies back in the 90s that qualitative studies, up to close to 70% of the people that were in a Greek system had self-reported cheating on work, and there are huge scandals recently out of West Point. I think it was on a calculus test. UNC had a scandal a few years ago that netted several hundred people, many of them football players, many of them fraternities, which I think cheating is the most cynical thing. And that's when students realize that they don't really see the value in what they're doing and learning. They just see the value in the signal that comes from it. And even if there's not abject cheating, about 10 years ago, a really good book called The Shallows, sort of the author, I can't remember the name right off my head, but he was talking to students. They weren't really reading the books anymore. They were going to Wikipedia, kind of patch writing their papers, and just sort of skimming the surface to get enough that they needed to get the credit or the credential without actually trying to learn something. So we have a lot of students that come through the system that have learned how to play that system. They've learned that nobody really wants to hold them accountable for cheating. That it's not beneficial to organizations to say we've got these kids doing this. They've learned that you can skip reading the book and get the wiki rundown, or that you can borrow and patch write off of somebody else's paper, and that we don't have any real quantities, quantifiable data on that. But I think it's very frightening. We have a lot of people probably in positions of high authority that really have no education at all, even though they've got the papers hanging on their walls. But those are subjects that people are sort of reluctant to look into.
Now, what kind of cheating? Do you mean like plagiarism for writing papers, or actual answers on the calculus test that you get while you're in the classroom taking the test through an earbud or something, or I don't know what?
Yeah, we can't even really define that very well because patch writing is where somebody will take an excerpt and just change it enough so that it's not plagiarism. So how much of that do you have to do before you call that cheating? And or again, those are qualitative studies based on self-reporting. The evidence is not great. I'm not going to make them. I'm just talking about some of these because there's not been a real good way to actually go in and analyze and figure out how many people have been. And when it does hit the papers, as it has recently with West Point or UNC, there was I think a Princeton cheating on a take-home exam at one time. I could be wrong on that. I should probably be careful. This is a podcast specifically naming a school, but there was one of the Ivy League schools that had an issue that were big enough that the schools had to report on them. We don't really know how deep that problem goes.
But your point
the
is
master
that
learning model.
For example, I wouldn't cheat on a great courses class that I took online listening while I'm out riding my bike. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. Cheat for who? I'm just doing this for my own benefit. I'm not reporting to anybody that I passed the class or whatever. But there is this idea now. Just push back a little bit. Say, let's make a distinction between a Jeopardy champion. So I knew this guy. His name was Bob, and so he was a Jeopardy champion, and he told me, he wrote a book about this, and he told me how he studied for Jeopardy. And for example, he memorized all the presidents and vice presidents. He memorized all the English kings and queens and all the characters in Shakespeare's plays and the famous quotes and so on. But he said, if you ask me, do you understand British history? Do you understand Shakespeare and what the plays mean? He says, no, I don't have any idea what these plays are about. I don't know what they mean. I don't know what the deep, intrinsic value is of them is. I just memorized all these facts. So one argument is that, well, you go to the brick and mortar liberal arts college and you're there interacting with other students, late night bull sessions in the dorm, meetings with the professor, discussions in the classroom, like Michael Sandel's courses at Harvard are, I guess, the most popular courses there. And you can watch them online. They're all recorded, professionally recorded with high quality equipment. He has a TED Talk. I was in the audience when he did this. I mean, there was no lecture. He just starts talking about difference between virtue ethics of Aristotle and John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism and Kant's deontology. But he didn't even mention those things, barely. He just said, who should be given a violin or, whatever the subject was. And then he just starts going around the room. What's your name? And, okay, I think, the best qualified person should get the violin. Oh, yeah? How about you? And, oh, no, not the best qualified. The most needy person should get the violin. Why the most needy? And, all of a sudden it's just this engaging conversation. There's no lecture about deontological ethics versus virtue ethics or anything like that. And it's like, how that you can't package in well, maybe you can, I don't know. But that's the argument for why it's good to go to a college campus.
And I certainly wouldn't disagree with that, but it becomes a question of how much is that experience worth? So at its kind of far condition, there's a book called The Golden Passport by Duff McDonald about the Harvard MBA program. And a Harvard MBA costs about $250,000. And you think, what are they doing
for 2 years?
$250,000.
2 years?
$250,000. Yes.
For a 2-year
and what
MBA?
they're teaching
Holy moly.
They're teaching case studies. I teach a class using free ethics case studies that come off the University of North Carolina website from DePaul University in Indiana. I'm sure that Harvard provides a better experience than what I can with my online case studies that are open resources. But is it $250,000 better? Becomes the question.
Yeah.
And so
probably not. But if you had a Harvard MBA 30 years from now, you'll have $10 million more than you would have if you didn't have the MBA because you got hired by the bigger corporation or whatever.
Well, that's exactly what McDonald in his book says, is that what it really buys you is access to these Goldman Sachs and these firms that will come in and hire from that pool. But why are they interested? That's the model that's so fascinating. It's kind of like some of these programs are in the same way that social media influencers can be famous for being famous. Some of these programs are just prestigious because they're prestigious. It's not clear why that exists. And I think that part of it has to do. We have this model now that I think is becoming really cumbersome, which is that the college degree is supposed to, um, and people see that you have a degree from a certain institution, and the institution has said you have mastered this set of skills, and they're vouching for you. But we don't really need that anymore. We can just see if you've got the skills. If you've got a company that needs to hire people who can code, you can just ask them to code. We can go straight to the skill sets now. And there's some movement in Google and Amazon and some other places to just develop sort of internal degree programs that are more closely tailored to what their company specifically needs. And that it may be very near in the future that if companies start moving towards a question of can you, or MIT or whoever says, can you master these skills, as opposed to do you have this degree, that old economic model that we just discussed kind of shifts. And so one of the reasons that I've mentioned the MicroMasters program at MIT, and the reason I think this is so, again, I don't want to be too hyperbolic, but so monumental is it's going to cause this economic shift, which is to get a MicroMasters, you have to master the skill set. And MIT is shifting their prestige away from saying, did you get into our institution, which is how the big schools tend to measure their prestige now, to did you master this skill set? And if that becomes the future, then those degrees become worthless if they don't confer the specific skill sets. So if it is the case that you have to be able to solve calculus problems, or if you have to actually know anatomy or whatever, instead of asking for a degree, universities may or companies may just very well sit down and have you do this online module to determine your skill set. And if that degree didn't enhance your skills for that purpose, then it has no future in that environment. And I think that if the major institutions start to move away, I don't think exclusivity is trending very well in the 21st century. Their concepts of their colleges and their entrance is all based on this notion of you're really special if you got in. We've got to move away from that. If they do, and I think it's going to happen pretty quickly, towards can you master this skill set?
Do you happen to know if companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, when they want to hire programmers, if they say you need to have a bachelor's degree in computer science or a master's degree in computer science, or do they not care about that? Can they give some kind of test? I think isn't Google famous for inventing their own IQ test that you have to solve these weird abstract reasoning problems because that's what you got to do as a programmer or something like that?
Yeah, I think there were some famous problems that got out there, and for a while, once they got out, though, people figured it out and kind of gamed the system with them. They came in with knowledge ahead of time, but I'm not sure specifically what Google is saying now, but I do know that they have sort of internal programs that they're saying that you can go through and engage within mastery learning modules within the company that they're saying will confer the same status within that company as a college degree will.
Yeah, I don't know about the future of long-term future of higher education post-COVID. This is what your last article for us was about. It's not clear. I mean, I don't think the big ones are going to go out of business. I suppose some of the smaller universities and colleges that were kind of on the margin financially already, once their PPP loans are all dried up and they're not getting any more government money, I guess, a lot of them could go out of business. I haven't looked at what's going on with that in a few months. I don't know how that's trending now, but what do you see just sort of projecting out for the next 50 to 100 years, if you could go that far, about higher education?
I think two trends are occurring very quickly right now. One of them is that this mastery learning model is, I think, going to catch on. And at the same time, a lot of people just learned that they can work effectively from home. And broadband networks are going out all across the rural areas of the country. So as people start to move, and this is happening fast, there's been some really good recent reporting on a number of people who are saying, I'm just going to leave the suburbs and go buy some ground out in the country because I can work virtually now. As that happens, that's going to eventually relax, I think, some of the pressures on the suburban school districts. But as people are moving out into the country, they're going to want access to the same quality of public education, or same quality education. There maybe that may be where the mastery learning model really starts to fulfill that role. As that happens, as we start to see institutions saying that they're going to put their reputations behind the mastery of certain sets of skills, and say that to be, say, Harvard educated doesn't necessarily mean that you had great grades and a great resume coming through high school and were able to get through this exclusive process of winnowing into our school. But to be Harvard educated means to master a set of skills that Harvard has upheld as important. That is a really big shift. And I think that at some point we've got to move that way, because the current model has so many inherent problems in it that if it's not the teacher shortage, or if it's not the bubble bursting, or some of the high emotions that are coming in over curriculum, could be some other foreseen force that seems to be really shaking public education in a way that hasn't been shaken for a while.
Yeah, but at some point you have to assess the whether the skill set was learned or not. So you're back to something like a test.
Yeah, I'm a believer in the tests. I think we need to test much more than what we do. Um, I think that the reason that high stakes testing is not well embraced by teachers or people in public education is because we've tried to do it with one or two tests a year that are autopsies, and we've tried to do it along with grading. Whereas if we had hundreds of assessments that students could take until, just going back to my world map quiz example, we just keep taking it till you know all the countries are
I
at.
see. I see. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's a directed assessment directed toward learning, not evaluation on some global
Yeah,
cosmic
yeah.
scale. Yeah. I see. Now back to the earlier education. Um, again, but part of the zip code driven system is because it's public. And the idea is that we want all of our citizens to be educated. And, so you get these, sort of crazy anarcho libertarian capitalist types that say, just make all schools private, no public schools at all. That solves the problem. And then the counter is, well, then kids will fall through the cracks. The poor people won't get, an education, or they'll get a crappy education. Well, they're already getting a crappy education, and they're already falling through the cracks. I mean, I haven't seen the latest statistics of LA County School District. I think is the second largest in the country behind New York. But, some two-digit number percentage don't even graduate from high school, much less, master some set of skills that gets them into college or whatever. It's pretty bad. So what's wrong with that argument?
Well, there's just the there's no teachers. There's not enough teachers for this. And there was a study done a few years ago that seized on by people that wanted the privatization. That said, look, public school teachers are overpaid because teachers are actually paid quite a bit less in private schools than they are in public schools, and so the unions are inflating. But the problem with that is that we don't market education in the United States from student to teacher. We market a body of education, a school, to people, and so you don't get to pay for just one teacher when you go into a school. You buy the whole apparatus that comes with it, and so to try to open up to a model like that would potentially have the effect of having students go in without really anybody to step in. The staff shortages in the schools right now are overwhelming, and especially when you start talking about teacher aides, et cetera, that some places, many rural districts in the country, the school district is the largest single employer in the county. And it used to be that jobs with the school were very popular, because if you drove a bus, if you worked as a secretary, or in a lunchroom or whatever, you could be off at the same times as your kids or grandkids. People aren't even taking those jobs. And one of the reasons that that's happened has been the enormous, and I think unsustainable, stress that has been put on teachers, um, going back about 20 years. And it's become, something has happened that you can't put your finger on, because it started probably around 2000, 2005, where young people were going up to the favorite teachers and saying, hey, I want to teach. And the teachers were going, don't do this. Don't enter this profession. And there's no quantitative analysis of that, but I know it's been happening. And so now we're coming into a situation where school districts are having a lot of trouble staffing, and for the foreseeable future, they're having trouble.
Is that
Many of the
because
school districts
the
are
money
high
is just so
percentages.
is just so poor they can do better elsewhere?
When they do studies of teachers, the teachers seem to want a supportive administration more than they want the money. If we go back to what I was saying earlier about schools becoming corporations, I think the worst thing that happened to public schools was when the administrative class decided they were in. This has become the kind of guiding analogy. They were in customer service. That that when parents complain about, because there's intense pressure to get these kids through that system, to get them the right grades into the right colleges, that pipeline that we talked about kind of goes from the suburbs to universities. That within that system, the the teacher is in a situation where teachers are not allowed to criticize school districts. They're not allowed to publicly say anything. And oftentimes, when there's a problem, a lot of times they're coming into the classroom not really all that well prepared by their university experience. And then they're finding that the enormous pressure of planning the lesson, implementing it, and then entering all of those grades and then oftentimes being expected to coach or do something on top of that is overwhelming. And it's something like 50% of teachers leave the classroom within the first 5 years. So we just have this constant rollover, and teachers don't really hit a high point in terms of their expertise until they get to like year 10. So we're not sustaining the teachers that we have, and we're just continually turning them over. And so the educational experience is oftentimes given to students may not be as good as it can be anyway because of those problems. But it's becoming more and more severe.
If we had something like a government bailout of the problem, something like we just issued $1 trillion infrastructure. What if the government said, all right, we're going to print another $1 trillion for the education infrastructure program, and we're going to just double the salary of all teachers and teacher assistants and so forth? And would that do it? Would that do anything? Given that if you compare the United States to many Northern European countries, their educational systems, which are public, they're way better than ours in terms of like scoring on math and reading levels at fourth grade, eighth grade, and 12th grade. We're like, I forget where we are. We're way down, like 50th place in the world or something. Kind of embarrassing.
Well, it's yet our grades are high.
Yeah, the
The
grades
grades
are
that
high.
enter
Yeah,
the grade.
right.
Well, that's that. None of that money would change the medieval structure of school districts. That teachers are at the bottom of a kind of feudal system where they oftentimes feel disempowered. And there were some studies that were done about 20 years ago that didn't take off about how teachers would have their mental health affected by administration that would really put pressure on them to do what the community wanted. And so it's become harder and harder for teachers to feel like they're professionals shaping the field. They feel more like pawns in somebody else's system, and they're continually pressured by forces that don't really have much to do with actually teaching students how to learn. And that's the problem. And there are answers to that. And I think the answer to that is develop large scale mastery learning models that ensure the same quality education across the board. We know that students need to go to school. The pandemic revealed that when the schools went virtual, something like 3 million women had to come out of the workforce because they had to stay home with their children. That's not sustainable. So we have to have a place for kids to go, but they can do these modules, and they can also have a teacher who is an expert in the room that brings in lessons that are gaps within that are specific to the local community. And I think that here's one of the more revolutionary ideas, that we should just do one thing at a time. I mean, if you wanted to learn something, would you do it with 6 other subjects? Or would you just learn the specific content and skills that you were focused on? Just learn physics for 3 hours a day until you learn something, as opposed to learning physics for 45 minutes and then going and learning Shakespeare and then jumping from one to the next. Just let people sit and learn until they get to the level of mastery. And that would be pretty revolutionary, I think, in the way that students have an experience at school would be different, less frustrating.
Have you followed the research on school vouchers? I haven't in decades. I remember when Thomas Sowell was making the argument in the 90s for school vouchers that, poor black families should have a choice of where to send their kids. And, everybody gets a voucher and then they'll migrate to the better schools and too bad for the crappy schools. That's just the way it goes. And the market will kind of settle that out. And I recall there were some studies that said, yeah, this is working really well. Others said, no, it doesn't work at all. And I have no idea what the literature says on that now.
Yeah, if I followed that in the state that I live in, is really one of the most robust voucher systems in the country, and it's not really had the educational effect I think that they were hoping it would. I do think that the voucher argument has become sort of obsolete because going back to our example earlier, if you take a Wondrium course, for example, uh, we can now replicate excellent teaching with just a link across 13,600 school districts, and essentially say that all of these students are having access to the same high quality education. That you won't be kind of put in a situation as a student or family where you don't know what the quality of that teacher is going to be or the quality of that school. You're sending kids in for a mastery learning experience where you know that the kids in the suburbs and the kids in the inner city are going to have access to the exact same educational tools. They're going to have different teachers that are going to have certain lessons that are tailored to the individual community needs. And there's going to be people there to care for those kids. But the basic educational experience that they would have, the level of skills that they would need to master, would be the same. And I think, and as we start talking about equity, there's a couple of ways we can talk about equity, which is sort of trying to sanitize campuses, or we can actually deliver the same kinds of opportunities to everybody. And that second option is now possible. And I'm hoping that that's the trend. But I think that if we do have a model like that in place, then some of those voucher discussions will become, I think, less and less relevant.
And to what extent would teachers' unions support this or oppose this?
Well, we would have, I should say, I'm in a teachers union. I was also a factory machinist for 5 years. I was not an auto worker. So I'm a long time union member of
Union
things.
man.
Well, I don't know that I am. My
Oh,
eyes are wide
okay.
open,
All right.
but I think they do more good than harm. Uh, but I don't know if that's a ringing endorsement. But the uh, the unions would have to embrace a new concept of what it means to be a teacher. A teacher is no longer going to be someone that is filling out the grade book, etc. Teachers are going to be people that are connected to the local business community and connected to the academic community, and they're learning with people. So if I have a teacher in STEM that is going out here and learning from Eli Lilly or a pharmaceutical company, and they're coming back in and replicating in the classroom the kinds of things they learned while out there in the business world, and they're having the students do the same kind of thing. You can have students who finish a product, and then that local business comes in and says, "That's what I have people doing out here that I'm paying them for." They provide what we call, the authentic audience. And if you're in a rural district, you could have that occur, with a connection with agriculture, or you could have it, some kind of a connection with local, whatever the local businesses are, and so that you might ameliorate some of that effect of, hey, college education always takes our kids away from us in our rural urban communities. Instead, those students are actually trying to solve problems that are there, and their teachers are helping them to solve those problems and become immersed within that community. And it's just a different concept of what it means to be a teacher. And under that concept, we would need fewer teachers, to be honest, and we have fewer teachers. So this is an honest reckoning with the coming of the teacher shortage would be something along this kind of model that I'm describing.
Yeah, if we have teachers unions, why aren't there students unions? Who's looking out for the interests of the students?
Well, when you consider a teachers union, um, why is it that teachers feel the need to have a large scale union that if they're in an environment where they're supposed to be supported and helped by the administrative groups, why do they feel the need to have this other
Yeah.
massive organization defending them.
Yeah.
And that in itself is an issue.
Yeah.
When you have
What's
large
the
scale
answer to
unions,
that?
it doesn't necessarily indicate. Well, the system has not really evolved to be super teacher friendly. Uh, the teachers oftentimes, as I said, if teachers are asked in surveys uh, whether they prefer supportive administration or a pay raise, they usually say supportive administration. And when teachers report being happy, 95% of them, they're happy because they have a supportive administration, which would indicate that the number of teachers who are unhappy or leaving the profession are leaving because they don't feel supported. Um, and that's probably the number one driving factor for people joining the union is that they feel as if they want some organization to support them as opposed to uh, organizations or the apparatus of education that's supposed to help them, they don't always feel does.
Well,
So I did a book a few years ago, the analogy, but I'm sorry.
no, no.
I did the book was called Beyond Obsolete, which you were kind enough to give a blurb for. And the analogy there was that there's a software of education, which is things that teachers need to do to update our practices for improving in-class outcomes. But then there's the hardware update, which is the administrative apparatus that needs to change to make that compatibility. And I think that the hardware update, for reasons that I've discussed, is going to be nearly impossible unless we have some kind of state and federal law that says that schools must offer a mastery learning model alongside the seat time model within schools. And let's see there's your competition. Let's see which one families and students will choose. Will they choose, I need to sit in a class for 180 days? Or will they choose, I need to master this skill set with help from an expert in the room? And once I've
Mm-hmm.
mastered that skill set, I can, which one will they choose? And I think that's the more interesting question as we move into this, a little further into this decade.
Well, the views of teachers' unions by people on the right. We can call it the Fox News version of teachers' unions. It's just it's a socialized system in which the emphasis is to get more pay and free time off and vacations and holidays for teachers. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example. The teachers' union said, no, teachers are not going back in the classroom, but we still want to get paid. And they're going to try to carry this on. And so, it's a pretty bad and surely very slanted view of teachers' unions. But maybe there's an element of truth in that, in that criticism.
Well, in the vast majority of states, the unions don't have very much power. And I think Fox News kind of seized on what was happening in California and Chicago. When if you really look at the numbers, most of the schools were open, at least hybrid, or teachers were at real risk. One of the online comedians said teachers were given PPE, personal protective encouragement, to go buy a mask. It was just that it was that there were considerable risks that a lot of people put themselves under to go in and actually teach students. And I think that there's a reluctance, for reasons I've discussed, that some of the conservative commentators are kind of caught in a little bit of a conundrum, which is that they're not big fans of public education, but for reasons that I've stated, public education is one of the key driving factors in local business communities. And so they're just sort of reluctant to people in the local chamber of commerce don't want to hear too many bad things about the local teacher, the local schools, because that's what's bringing kind of people into your community that spend money. Your real estate agents don't want to hear criticisms of schools, and they're not necessarily all that thrilled about charter schools or virtual, et cetera. And so instead of criticizing what may be systemic issues with education, it's sort of easy within that business analogy that was established by No Child Left Behind to just criticize the normal target of the criticism, which is a union. Say, well, the unions are causing these problems because they see the administrative groups within the schools as kind of analogous to the business management community. And who's always giving fits to the business management? It is the teachers union. That does not mean that teachers unions don't have some things to answer for. There may have been more creative solutions going back, and if we could go back and do a few things over again, I think you could definitely make the case that closing the schools did more harm to students than keeping them open would have. But to be fair, everybody was kind of feeling their way through the darkness at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Not
of course.
exactly sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. To be fair, I agree. Are there, since you're such a worldly guy and an international man of mystery, are there other countries that you can look at and go, yeah, we should do what Norway's doing or Germany or whoever that do seem to have good outcomes as measured by these more universal tests of mastery of subject matter.
You know, the situations in some of those other countries are so different. They bring with Finland was the big model for a while,
Oh
and there's
yeah,
some things that
Finland.
we can
Yeah,
take.
yeah,
But Finland's a very small population.
yeah.
They certainly treat their teachers well. South Korea had a model for a while where one of the English teachers was making like 6 million a year because
Whoa.
he was doing what's so common now, which was English. Learning English was very popular because you make a lot more money if you can speak English. And so he was replicating his teaching via DVDs and tapes and spreading those and making a pretty good living. But if you look at South Korea in particular, um, there's the tradition of the hagwon, which is the after school crammer, and kids will kind of sleep their way through the school day, and then what they really want to pay for is the individual teacher. So they'll go to these crammers after school. There's no amenities. It's just a room and a whiteboard, and they just want to get the straight calculation. They want to know how to solve the problems. They want to know the equations. Um, I don't think that's a good model. It's put people under enormous stress. It has improved the scores and the economy in South Korea. But I think that if we look at this mastery learning model, it's obviously possible to take really good teaching and simply now we can just make it a link and replicate it for people in all kinds of situations and start to bring more equality to the educational system by learning how to do that. We no longer have to have good teaching replicated thousands of different times in thousands of different rooms because that in-person experience needs to be a part of education. But the core of it now can be people trying to learn things through these kinds of models. And I think that's probably where we're going. There'll be plenty of, done right, there'll be plenty of reading and writing in those models as well.
What do you think about the Asian model of, sort of uber discipline of their children to get them into Harvard, starting at kindergarten, and so you end up with these cheating, these university scandals where these rich parents are paying to get their kids into the best schools, and so on, and it starts at a very early age. I mean, I live in Santa Barbara. There's these prep schools that talk about,
Oh,
like
yeah.
how many of their students go on to this prep school, which then sends them into Harvard and the Ivy Leagues and so on. It's like, you got to be kidding me. I'm not even going to be thinking about this. At kindergarten, he's 5 years old. What? And but
Yeah.
that's kind of what the model is driven. So you end up with like a lawsuit against Harvard that you're letting in too many Asians because they score so high on the SATs because their parents have been driving them for 10 years to be able to master those particular skills that Harvard's looking for.
Well, it's just a very cynical view of education. It embraces the idea that the goal of education is Sanjay Samra in his book Grasp said that schools do two things. They educate and they winnow. And the embracing of the winnowing function is to say that your education has no meaning unless it moves you through the system to ever higher levels of exclusivity. And that's never been a model of education that I could embrace. I read books and listen to lectures and study things because I enjoy it, and then see natural connections across that hopefully allow to for us to make a contribution as teachers, writers, etc. And that notion that education exists to funnel people into elite institutions, I think is very cynical. And I think we ask kids the wrong question. We always ask kids, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? I think we should ask them what contribution they want to make. And if we ask them what contribution they want to make to society, it's a very different take. The reason that you study neurosurgery is not so you can get paid very well as a neurosurgeon, so that you can save people. You make a real the reason that you go learn how to put in heating and air conditioning is that you can alleviate conditions for people in droughts and heat waves, et cetera. And you get paid for doing good, but it's the contribution that you're making that should be useful, not the signal that comes from being entered into these elite institutions. So that I find that kind of the anti-version of what I see education's purpose being.
Well, Chris, this is it's hard to say how this is going to pan out in the next 50 to 100 years. I mean, the university system is what, maybe 1,000 years old. This is turning the Titanic, very, very, very slowly. I think we're probably going to end up with multiple models competing, all these online options that are available. You can be an autodidact. You don't have to go to college. I don't know if you saw Bill Maher's rant last Friday on, why should poor people pay taxes that support rich people sending their kids to college to make them even richer, and that it
Yeah.
increases that income gap even more. It was kind of an interesting take along those lines.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of questions. Um, when you look at the size of some of the sports stadiums and some of the salaries of the coaches and the money that's being made off of these sports
Millions.
programs that are almost they're
Unbelievable.
just sort of barely even connected to the experience of the university. Um, it's for education, as we've mentioned, that at a market value can be delivered uh, for next to nothing. It just seems unsustainable. Economists, I think, one day will marvel that we were carrying around $1.8 trillion in debt from education that was free for so people to buy education that you get for nothing. I mean, I think it's temporary. I just don't see how that continues, um, because it just seems to me like at some point the question that I see so many young people asking on YouTube, which is why am I paying all of this tuition money to get the education live that I can get better by watching this video clip? Why am I doing that? And once you have it may, who knows, it may look something like cryptocurrency. Once you have some of these uh, organizations like Wondrium or Flipping Physics or whatever, what if they start offering credentials? And it may not be right now. People buy these services so that they can do well in universities to get the credential. But what going back to MIT, what the MicroMasters program has done has unified those. And so you can get a MicroMasters now at MIT just going through the online module for about $1,000. If you take the test, it's like $200 more. And MIT is saying we're going to give you an MIT credential for basically engaging in the same kinds of things that you can get very cheaply over the internet. And I just don't see how that doesn't catch on. That has been something that's been very popular in poorer parts of the world, in many parts of the developing world, and it can be delivered globally. I'm just struggling to see how a model from K-12 all the way up to post-secondary that's based on a medieval concept of education. I'm struggling to see how that outcompetes the MOOC.
Yes, well, without with government intervention, it can
Yeah,
compete. It can be sustained forever, essentially. Which is why maybe if it was more market oriented, then people would vote with their time and dollars to go the MOOC courses or the Wondrium or Khan Academy. We haven't talked about that. I remember seeing Khan give a talk at TED. I think it might have been 2006 TED or maybe one of the other years, and about these short 5-minute videos on physics problem or calculus or math or English or whatever. He had a bunch of examples. It was stunning. And then after I left the room, I saw Bill Gates migrate right over to him and was talking to him. I thought, the Gates Foundation is going to jump on this, and they did. They funded the Khan Academy, but I haven't looked in years to see how they're doing. I presume they're still cranking out thousands of these short tutorial videos that are really effective.
yeah, they're all over YouTube. But they're what's happened with the Khan Academy has happened. There's just so many of these. They're all so high quality, and to they've evolved to reach an audience. Like if you look at PBS's Crash Course Physics with Shimi Samara, I mean, it's just brilliant, and it's you can just watch that. And she's got so much personality and intelligence, and it's just so watchable. And then you can sit and, like I said, sometimes I have to watch them 5 or 6 times to understand the equation. But she's not getting impatient with me because she's just recording. I just keep going back and clicking. I can do it while I'm doing the dishes or whatever. And I think that, as we start talking about the fact that there are some people who are feeling alienated uh, by the educational system, maybe for systemic reasons, for whatever reason, a lot of people are saying they're not comfortable with the educational system and structure as it is. This alternative is there. And so it seems like this would be a really good response to if someone says, look, there are systemic problems that can't be solved within the educational structure. Um, if that can't be solved, then let's just look at another way. Let's deliver education to people in their neighborhoods. Let's deliver it to them let's deliver it to them in an environment they feel comfortable with. And let's say to them that all you have to do is provide the motivation to study and master these skills, and you can get the credentials. You don't have to go through this whole system of being winnowed into a group that's considered elite that goes on the campuses. That what is required now is just the mastery of these skills. And I think I think that's the way to deliver genuine equity to people who are in communities that feel disempowered.
Well, let's get you at the as the head of the Department of Education under President Biden. Although I guess they can only do so much, right? Because the states all have their own departments of education. It's also splintered. There is no universal system set up from the top down to make changes like that.
They could do quite a bit, I think. I agree with you under normal circumstances, but a federal mandate that was attached to dollars that said schools have to offer a mastery learning model next to the seat time model would do it. It would be that simple. That if you that you wouldn't even have to go and make significant changes to the bureaucracy. You would just have to say and have it prepared that here is a mastery learning model that is created by experts at the universities. It's in alignment with learning theory. We have it for a series of subjects. Here's what it looks like. And here's the expectations for teacher professional development. And this is the subject of my research, which has been funded by a group called Scientech, and then also through the state of Indiana. We put teachers with content area experts in their fields and put them out in the communities, in the business community, and then they made classroom-ready lesson plans, what I call teacher-generated curriculum, that could then be implemented. So at the end of the professional development, they had something they could implement, and they got paid for that. That a model like that, if the federal government said that this has to be implemented along with the seat time model, and that if you don't, you're not going to get these federal funds, and then let them compete side by side. See how many students, how many families choose that mastery learning model versus the seat time model, and just see how that plays out. See what the results are. There were some studies done in Turkey that indicate that mastery learning models had vastly better outcomes than seat time models, and we can just play that out.
Yeah, no, that sounds great to me. But how much of the seat time model is based on two parents working, and that if kids went to school, say from 9 to 1 or 10 to 2 or something like that, one of the parents would have to cut way back on their working hours just to with young children especially.
Oh yeah, but you think instead of we want kids to be involved in extracurriculars and physical education. Read is it Dr. Lieberman did the book Exercised that you had on the podcast. I read his book, and he was talking about how hard he couldn't get physical education brought back to the Ivy League. We could have kids engage in intramural sports or plays, and so right now what we have is a full school day. Kids get done 3 or 4 o'clock, whatever, and then they've got another 2 hours of extracurriculars, and they come home completely wiped out. Whereas with the model, with the mastery learning model, they could engage with that for 3 or 4 hours in the morning, spend that rest of that time of the school day engaging in their extracurricular, getting some physical education, whatever it may be, or having conversations with other students, working on projects, and then go home and actually have an afternoon after the parents get home, as opposed to being constant. Because the anxiety levels that are developed by the seat time model for students are really one of the most damaging aspects of it. I mean, it's hard to believe how many students, the NEA did a study on this, the National Education Association, report high levels of anxiety or see it as a problem. Because all of that pressure that is put on getting through all of your classes, getting all of your grades in, and then also participating in extracurriculars, it's just overwhelming and unnecessary.
All right. How do you make this happen? You got to get a congressman or senator from your state to take this in to the Department of Education, or somebody in the Department of Education to pick this up. How do you make that happen?
It wouldn't be me. I don't have enough clout, but I think um, the light in the darkness has been for me the MIT MicroMasters program, and if there's an institution that could get this done,
Yeah,
it would
MIT.
be MIT.
Perfect. Yeah. All right.
But I'm hoping my goal is to write this book and then hopefully have some conversations. I don't know that they've seen that the colleges that are kind of embracing some of this have necessarily seen the implications it could potentially have at the secondary level. And if the job of university of secondary schools is for college and career readiness, which is what they proclaim, then as schools start moving towards that model, it becomes incumbent to start preparing them for more of a mastery learning.
Yeah. Mastery learning model. All right. Well, let's do another article in Skeptic about that and just try to spread the word along with this podcast. But I don't want to let you go. I mean, this is super important, but I loved your thought experiment. So give us a transition to the applications for education, what thought experiments do for education, why you think teachers should adopt this model of using thought experiments. And so give us a transition from what we've been talking about to this super interesting subject.
Well, my teaching is a direct. There's a direct connection between my teaching and the books that I like to read. You alluded in the beginning that there's a real damaging concept that good books can't be popular books, and I've always found that the explanations that I find from really good writers in nonfiction have the effect of stimulating me to want to share those ideas. And I've always really appreciated the use of thought experiments, but I've always thought when I've read about them or seen them in a lecture or something, I've always thought they were underused, and that the parameters for a thought experiment have not been really clear, or the purposes of them. And so I think most of the thought experiments work through the study of analogies. And almost always, when you have some kind of bad thought, or I think skeptics, when we dig into something and see that the logic has gone wrong, almost always there's a bad analogy at the core of that. And we don't really teach the idea of judging analogies or trying ways to, or finding ways to converse about analogies that would help us to come to clear understandings. And a thought experiment is perfect for helping people in general, students, whoever, uh, to 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 set the parameters of their thinking with the right analogy, with the right forms of analogous thinking. So that was really the contribution I was hoping that the book would make. And there's a whole bunch of them that I just find really interesting that I wanted to share.
Oh, they are. I mean, of course, the most famous ones of Einstein having a dream or a thought experiment, a reflection on what it would be like to be on a beam of light, or falling down an elevator shaft, and he and his pin are falling the same rate, so that would be essentially a gravity free environment, something like that, and therefore acceleration of the floor of the elevator up, that's like gravity, and so forth. Or the other one that's so nicely portrayed in the HBO series about his life, where he's talking to his friend about being on a train and two lightning bolts hit at the same time when you're sitting on the train and it's not moving. But if the train is moving and it approaches the one lightning bolt, sooner than the other one's moving away from the other one, then the lightning bolts don't hit at the same time. And the friend
Yeah.
can't get it. He's like, "Now close your eyes and just picture this." And he keeps repeating it until the friend gets it. And it's not. There is no absolute fixed time. It's relative and so on. Anyway, that's kind of the famous example of a thought experiment. But most people think, well, I'm not Einstein, so I can't have thought experiments like that. But your point is that we do these all the time for everything.
Oh yeah, I get relativity. One of my favorite things is to ask people to look at a clock and look at a ruler. These are two very everyday items that they've seen. They've never realized the clock is a ruler bit into a circle, and that's because they were developed. This kind of quantified measurement was developed about the same time in Europe, and then you start thinking about the analogies for that. If I drive a mile versus walking a mile, my experience of that distance is different. And then at very high speed, your experience of time becomes different. And then you start looking at all of the mental effects that come from our understanding. Um, some people, other people have done work on this, but the effect that the clock had on our mentality. We think of time as money. You save it, you spend it, you waste it, and so it starts. There's all of these sort of mental aspects that nothing ever stays where it starts, and so you end up with some kind of quantified measurement. Then you have from that a series of analogies that end up having effects and impacts on whole other areas of thought that are maybe completely unrelated to the original.
Yeah, I think of like the trolley problem. If
Yeah,
for people not familiar with this, for the three people on the planet not familiar with this, the trolley's hurling down the track and you're at the branch there and it's about to kill these five workers. You throw the switch, it'll kill the one worker. And these are always premised on, well, why can't I just yell, get up, there's a train coming? No, no, you're not allowed to
yeah,
do that. Okay. And they're deaf, by the way, and they can't hear the vibration of the train coming.
yeah.
There's so many qualifications on the, but the purpose of this is to kind of push your parameters of how you think about moral issues, just to see how far you'll go. Would you heave a fat man off the bridge, and that stops the trolley, but you got to physically grab the guy, and so you're more physically involved, emotionally involved. That changes the way people think. So there you have a pure thought experiment that has no relevance to the real world in a sense, because you could always yell out to the workers, get up, or have a double brake reduction system on the train. But that misses the point of the thought experiment, right?
Well, yeah, I think even that particular thought experiment I've always had problems with, because a lot of times what they would do is sort of take that and then compare it to the somebody in a waiting room of a hospital, and you've got four people who need organs. Is it ethical then to kill the one person to harvest the organs to save the four? And the problem with those two scenarios is they're not the same. Is that you're very rarely going to come across a trolley scenario, but you very frequently come across people in hospital waiting rooms. And if we say it's okay to kill somebody in a hospital waiting room and harvest their organs, people are going to stop going to the hospital. That's going to do more harm overall. So I think you're actually on pretty firm legal territory or ethical territory, logical territory. If you say, I would shove the person, but I would not kill the person in the hospital waiting room. I don't see a contradiction there, just because I'm not going to come across very many trolley situations, but I'm going to come across people in hospitals a lot. And so I think that's actually a lot of times the issue with ethics becomes um, there's no firm rule. And a lot of philosophers, even really well-known philosophers, look at ethics and just hands off because they say it's too adjusted to local custom, etc. Um, One of the Kant's categorical imperative, which is if I do something, should it be a universal rule? Well, if you can imagine, as I did in the book, British soldiers in a trench and German soldiers in a trench, and one of the soldiers says, "Hey, if all of us put our weapons down, we all survive." But how do you define all? If just the British troops put their weapons down, they're all going to be killed. Or if you come to that conclusion, you put your weapon down, all you've done is lessen the ability of your side to protect themselves. So it's hard to see how that form of reasoning ethically actually helps you in that kind of a situation. And there's a lot of situations like that where you really can't do a kind of 2 + 2 = 4 kind of study of ethics because it is so connected to really um, delicate forms of analogy that if we're not careful with them, if the two situations are not directly the same in some ways, then they sort of fall apart in terms of trying to transfer the reasoning from situation A to situation B.
Yeah, I see philosophers get into trouble with these thought experiments. They end up going down this long path and end up at some conclusion that doesn't seem to really make sense when you think about it in the real world. Here, I'm thinking of Sam Harris's endorsement of torture, and he himself says, "I'm just using the standard argument from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the ticking time bomb. We got this guy here. He knows where the atomic bomb is hidden in LA. And if we apply the right amount of pain, he will tell us where the bomb is, and therefore we'll save 5 million people. Is it okay to torture and even kill the one to save the 5 million? Something like a trolley problem like that. Well, I call it. So I wrote one of my Scientific American columns about this, and I call this the 24 version of torture. That is that TV series called
Yeah.
24 with Kiefer Sutherland plays Jack Bauer. No, I think I called it the Jack Bauer theory of torture. As the television viewer, you know that Jack has the guy that planted the bomb, and that guy knows where it's located. And he's going to tell Jack Bauer if Jack just applies the right amount of pain and suffering, and even killing the guy, right after he tells him where the bomb is. But we're the real world is not television viewers. We don't know if we have the right guy. And the studies I read when I was writing that column showed we rarely get reliable intelligence from the torture programs we've implemented. Enhanced interrogation, like at Abu Ghraib, and because we know that going back to the witch burnings in the Inquisition, people will say anything to stop the pain. They'll just make stuff up. There's a famous case of a German jurist it was just a local prince, I guess, and the local witch hunters came to him and said, "Well, we got the right person who did it. Caused the plague or whatever it was, the drought." And he said, "Are you sure?" He goes, "Oh yeah. We applied the right torture and so on." He goes, "All right, let's go down there." So they go down there, and the prince says to the witch, the accused witch, "Woman, one of these two people here, I have strongly suspect have been in cahoots with Satan. What say you?" Turn the rack a little more, torture her, and she goes, "Oh no, I can tell you for sure. I saw both of them cavorting with the devil, and they turned into frogs, and this happened and that happened." And of course that's the problem. People will say whatever they want. So there's the thought experiment. Under perfect conditions, all other things being equal, and yes, we got the right guy and we got the right intel. Well, yeah, of course, most people go, okay, yeah, kill the one to save the five. But that isn't how the real world works.
No, and in terms of the conversation, or the way in which I like to pose the conversation over ethics is to push something to what I call an extreme analogy. So, the example I like to use, if you and I were discussing the Second Amendment, and it's what is it that the word arms in the Second Amendment would what is it that gives you the right to bear? We push it to the extreme. We can say, can an individual own a hydrogen bomb? And you and I can agree that no. And we just keep backing it up. What about an atom bomb? What about a tank? Until we find the point of disagreement. That's where we need to talk. And if I say you can own a tank and that the Second Amendment covers that, and someone else says no, what is different about the tank from the atom bomb? And what is so that becomes the point of the conversation. So if we could sit here and imagine a situation where we would both agree that torture would be permissible, maybe it's an extreme, outlandish case, then potentially we could continue to back that up until it became a point of dissent between us, and then have a discussion at that point as to why it is that we felt like we agreed torture was possible here and we don't here, and what is the difference between those two situations. And one of the thought experiments in the book is serious category errors. I was very disturbed by the movie Free Solo. Or if you've seen Free Solo, uh, climber Alex Honnold climbed El Capitan in Yosemite without, it was basically a sheer cliff face without any kinds of harness or protective equipment. And National Geographic filmed this, and it was a very successful documentary. And I think it's because the public and the people around Alex framed that as a great athletic accomplishment. But we could potentially frame that as a suicide attempt. And if someone said so I started thinking about analogical analogies to this. If someone said that they wanted to play Russian roulette, would we film that? So what is the difference between what he did and Russian roulette? And then the answer to that might be, well, what he did required skill. Well, if I had a friend that was a really expert violin player, she wanted to play a virtuoso piece, but said she wanted to do it suspended over a vat of crocodiles, and that if she played a wrong piece, that vat would open and she would be devoured, I don't think I would grab a camera. And when you really break down what he was doing, he was essentially announcing to people that he was going to be famous or he was going to be dead. he was either going to reach the top of El Cap or he was going to die in the pursuit of it. And there was no middle ground that was acceptable to him. To which it's not clear to me that allowing him to climb that free solo was the best answer. Maybe that was something that should have been answered with therapy. But there's a category error because people framed it in terms of the kind of narrative that we like, the hero narrative of the person completing some kind of great academic or athletic achievement, instead of looking at it as a potential mental health issue. And so I framed that in the book as well, which is to take this example that's very famous and then sort of ask the question as to what were the ethics of the people around him when he declared his intent to climb this without any support.
Yeah, well,
it's an interesting discussion.
You also know that they made a big deal about his girlfriend and how anxious she was about it. So they kind of set that up as the tension. You're like the girlfriend watching, going, "Oh my god, oh my god." And without that tension, then it loses some of its impact. Yeah. What are some of the other categorical errors here? I'm thinking of like self-driving cars. You often see the trolley problem. The Tesla's driving down the street and there's 3 people in the crosswalk. You have 2 people in the back seat. There's somebody on the sidewalk. Does it hit the 3 people? Does it jump onto the sidewalk and kill the 2 people to save the 3 people? But what about the 2 people in the back? I remember having this discussion with Bill Nye the Science Guy, who said, double reduction brake system, so you never have to face that challenge.
Well, I like what he said there because a highly functioning AI shouldn't let you get into those positions. They should sort of count, in the same way that my wife's car beeps as I'm going to back into something. It should determine factors that, sunlight in your eyes plus baby crying. An effective AI might slow you down at that point, or recognize that there are factors that usually when you have a crash, there's a confluence of factors that are coming together. And a highly functioning AI would prevent you from that. I think the bigger ethical question is if we have self-driving cars, what do you do with people who drive things like motorcycles for pleasure? That if you've got 2 reasons why we drive, which is the first one is just basic transportation, which we tend to want to be safe. And the other one is that people like to drive sports cars. They like to drive motorcycles. Will we put them in a separate lane? And if so, do you end up creating kind of statistical death lanes where all of the accidents will occur? There'll be no accidents on the lanes driven by AIs, but all these accidents over here.
Yeah, you have racetracks that people go out to, or mountain roads that are reserved just for renting them out to people that want to drive for fun, something like that. I mean, there are tracks like that for people that race cars. One of my cycling buddies is into this stuff. And, you pay a fee, you go out and you race against other people with their cars in the same category and so on. I'm predicting that, maybe in 50 years, if you want to drive an internal combustion engine, you want to drive an old, Chevy Camaro with the big muscle car engine, you just go to this track and you get to drive one, and it's, it'll become recreation.
That may be true. I can see how the Harley driving community would respond to being told they couldn't drive on the interstates.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, of course.
I don't think that.
Yeah. I have a feeling this is all going to happen slow enough that there's not going to be any existential threat to civilization as it's often portrayed by the AI existentialists. I just don't think it. The government regulators are strong enough to prevent anything catastrophic happening. The analogy I make, if I program into my Tesla, I just hold the button and say, navigate LAX, and then it tells me where to go and so forth. It's not going to tell me drive up on the sidewalk and plow through 20 people to avoid this traffic jam. But if it did, how many nanoseconds would it be before Elon Musk got sued, Tesla got sued by regulators, for messing up their programming? You can't do this. This would just never happen on any kind of scale. Short of a terrorist, taking over the entire self-driving internet system that's supposed to going to be in place at some point when all cars are self-driving. But again, I just see this happening slowly enough that between engineers programming and regulators checking the engineers to make sure nothing terrible happens, there'll always be accidents. But but fewer, that nothing catastrophic is going to
Yeah, and I think that artificial intelligence just depends on the level of interaction you want to have. It might be at some level of interaction that it's indistinguishable from a person, but if you really want a best friend that's an AI, it may be harder and harder for the artificial intelligence to replicate
happen.
um,
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
replicate those kinds of activities. You see,
All
uh,
right, let's finish up and
yeah,
talk about
those provide.
let's talk about thought experiments and politics. I thought this was a really interesting chapter in your book. You have this clip from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, how is that a thought experiment, and how does that cash out into real world political laws and decisions?
Well, I think that that's got to be the most misread statement in all of history. I can't see any evidence that, and I want to be careful when I'm saying this. I'm trying to contextualize, but I don't think Jefferson meant it in the sense that all men are created equal. People forget that he's writing that to a king, King George III. And King George III thinks that he is better than everyone. And so when he reads that, all men are equal means that you're not better than the rest of us. That I think it was more of a statement about the king not having any special powers than it was a general philosophical statement. And so when Jefferson writes that, he's establishing a syllogistic base for the rest of the Declaration, which really is mostly a series of complaints that he's putting out as evidence that the king has broken a social contract. We start looking into that, and we end up going all the way back to the 1688 Glorious Revolution in England, which is really driven not by Enlightenment ideals, but by Protestant ideals. The kind of people who were in the Parliament were mostly Protestant. People who don't believe the king got his, or the Pope got his powers from God, aren't going to believe the king did either. They end up driving off the Catholic James II, instituting the Glorious Revolution. Well, it's after that that John Locke justifies the takeover of power in secular terms. There's not much evidence that Jefferson had read John Locke, but the American system was seemingly kind of based off of this British concept that you would have a parliament in opposition to the sovereign. And they did have political parties, but it really was seen, and Montesquieu wrote about the idea that you would have these governmental bodies that would be divided into three parts that would take power away from the what we'll just loosely call the executive. When the Constitution was written, the concept of how political parties might affect that system did not seem to have been considered. And so we've got this real glitch in the system, which is political parties. And I proposed a thought experiment based on that you could run for, say, Congress or the House of Representatives without actually having a political party. And instead of a binary system where, is so frequently the case, you have a close election and 49% of the people want a Democrat, 51% want a Republican, but you get 100% Republican votes in the House now based off of that. Somebody can run and say, look, I'm not going to run for a political party, but I will send out a link the day after I'm elected and ask my constituents one question. How many times do you want me to vote with the Republicans over the next 2 years? And if that number compiled comes back as, say, 57%, you can just put that in an algorithm and randomly vote for the Republicans on 50% of the 7% of those votes. And then you no longer have a binary system that where somebody can get just a small number of the votes, but vote 100% for one party or the other. It's just an interesting thought as to how we might correct the problem or the glitch of the political parties.
It is a problem. I mean, the fact that I can predict what congressmen and senators are going to vote before I even know what the issue is. I can already tell you it's going to be, and everybody knows. It's like, then what's the point of even having a discussion about it? Except you hope that you might flip the one person, or if you need 60% rather than 51%, then in which case then you try to bring a few of them around. But that's not usually done through rational arguments. It's usually done through horse trading. I'll vote for your bill over there if you vote for my bill over here, something like that. That just seems like a broken system. Better than all the others that have been tried, as it famously said. But still, Let me just read you how I interpreted that phrase. This is from the Moral Arc, where I was reading Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin. And so he recounts the story of how the term self-evident, this is slightly different than what you're talking about, but how the term self-evident came to be added to Jefferson's original draft by Franklin. This happened on Friday, June 21st, 1776, because they used to write physical letters in the good old days, and you can track how these changes are made. So here, this is Walter Isaacson now describing Franklin's editing of Jefferson. The most important of his edits was small but resounding. He crossed out, using heavy backslashes that he often employed, the last three words of Jefferson's phrase, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," and changed them to the words now enshrined in history, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." The idea of self-evident truths was one that drew less on John Locke, who was Jefferson's favorite philosopher, than on the scientific determinism espoused by Isaac Newton and on the analytic empiricism of Franklin's close friend David Hume. In what became known as Hume's fork, the great Scottish philosopher, along with Leibniz and others, had developed a theory that distinguished between synthetic truths that describe matters of fact, such as London is bigger than Philadelphia, and analytic truths that are self-evident by virtue of reason and definition. The angles of a triangle equal 180 degrees, or all bachelors are unmarried. By using the word sacred, Jefferson had asserted, intentionally or not, that the principle in question, the equality of men and their endowment by their Creator with inalienable rights, was an assertion of religion. Franklin's edit turned it instead into an assertion of rationality. So here I was using this as building my case that it was Enlightenment, reason, rationality, scientific empiricism, and so on that pushed the arc of the moral universe more than religion did. And that was one of my specific examples there.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely agree that self-evidence is almost a geometric term, like an axiom, sort of a statement that people believe in. It. Very similar to the Vienna Circle, which later had basically these kinds of self-evident truths, is what they said. Bachelors are unmarried. Which Wittgenstein said was a tautology, and kind of throws Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead into a whole other universe they had to study. But then there were also truths that you could get just through scientific evidence. And so I think that concept of self-evident is what is so interesting about that is it establishes a kind of axiom that then has to be proven. And I think history has proven it, that there's been some really good books that have been written that compare, and one was called Why Nations Fail, that compare what they called participatory governments with governments that are extractive. And the participatory governments are better at just about everything than the extractive ones that tend to be dominated by dictators, et cetera. And so, or single party states. And I think we do a very poor job in my field of world history of articulating what I think is one of the great truths that participatory government's basic respect for human rights, that these are not Western values, these are universal values that just happen to develop in the West. That there was a series of historical forces that caused this, but it's popular everywhere. People in Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea and everywhere else like freedom. And it just happened to develop in the West for specific reasons. That doesn't make them Western values necessarily. But when I look back at Jefferson, that phrase "all men are created equal," King George III is still a limited king, but believes that he's unequal. So I think we put in the context of him reading that what Jefferson was really saying, more so than all men are created equal, is to the king, you don't have any kind of divine right. And then from that flows basically the same kind of argument, but I think it's very frequently something that's taken without that context at the time. I really think it's impossible to understand what Lincoln called the common right of humanity, which is the Declaration of Independence, without holding it up to the divine right of kings and seeing that they're basically opposites to each
other. That's right. It's not at all empirically self-evident, and it certainly wasn't historically, because no one was following those tenets of government. And so it really took a war, Revolutionary War, and then a civil war, and then countless wars since to really bring it about. And now, 120 or so liberal democracies in the world out of the 180 countries. We're getting there. There's almost I think a trend, because I think it is in our nature. As you know, I agree with you that these are discovered truths, that people want freedom, because it's in our nature to do so. It's not self-evident, historically. You have to test it and you have to fight for it, but it's there. I think logically in that sense, derived therefore from reason instead of religion. Anyway, Chris, we've been going coming up on 2 hours. Give us some final thoughts on the use of thought experiments in any of our jointly interested topics that we care about, or just life in general.
My favorite thought experiment was one that I had published as a part of a book review, which is on time travel, which I think is a great thought experiment. And I think Stephen Hawking was always interested in time travel, not because it's possible, but because it was a thought experiment that helped you test the parameters of what time is. And the grandfather paradox has always fascinated me. Can you go back in time and kill your grandfather because that would mean that you don't exist? Um, when I really got to thinking about the grandfather paradox, it just ordinary science, the law of conservation forbids it. You were there when your grandfather was alive. You just weren't you. All of the particles in your body were there. And to go back in your current form would be to add mass to the universe, because those particles were already there in a way that would just simply violate basic science. And so, time and time again, when studying thought experiments, I found that it's the most basic scientific principles, the most basic economic principles, the simplest things that help us to understand and clarify our models. And going back to our discussion on education, I think it's a great thought experiment for everybody to ask when we start talking about education reform. Just one question: what would you do if you needed to learn something? And if the educational situation that you're in is not the answer, then that needs to change. That education needs to be created around that one question for us. If you need to learn something, I found time and time again that with thought experiments, there's an analogy issue that can be discussed through. Usually, when there's a problem with the thinking, it's because of a false analogy, and it's almost always the case that really simple to understand forms of science or thought help to untangle the paradoxes that we thought we had.
Perfectly put. I mean, most of life is thought experiments. We get up and think, well, what should I do today? I'm imagining, okay, I'm going to go do this, and I'm going to do that, and then this is going to happen, and that's going to happen, and oh, it didn't happen that way, but tomorrow I'll do it some other way. I'll tweak the variables. These are like counterfactual history experiments in my head, just walking around living life. So thank you so much for your work, Chris. Thanks for the conversation. I love all this stuff on education, especially. It's obviously important. I mean, it's hugely important. There's a few issues that are more important in society today than education. So thank you for your work. I hope you can implement these models and changes. We need to do something for sure.
Well, I appreciate all that you've done for creating a place for skeptics to have publications and conversations. You really built a place here for a conversation that has been much needed. So it's great to meet you.